But the second part, which is actually the larger part, is them grumbling and struggling and them getting through the desert and kind of this like back and forth of like, do we follow God? Do we go back to where we were? Kind of a thing. That's actually kind of where our life stands, right? That's our journey. We have been freed from death and error, but we have to continue relying and depending on God, lest we go back to that state and that oppression again.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 4 on the hymns on the Unleavened Bread, our journey with St. Ephrem as we're preparing for the Eucharistic Congress of the Eparchy. And today we're looking at death and error. And Father Joby and I will be kind of exploring this in our conversation here and the way St. Ephrem uses the Exodus story to illustrate the nature of death and error, but more importantly, how Jesus has conquered it. So, Father Joby, how are you doing?
Delightful. Delightful.
Nice. All right, could you open this up for us a little bit here? I mean, this analogy and this allegory that we see in the hymns.
Yeah, so in this particular hymn cycle, I think one of the prevailing biblical allegories or touchstones that Ephrem has is the Exodus story that we know pretty much the entirety, the book of Exodus, a story of redemption, a story of liberation, right? So I think when we read Ephrem, it's very important that we always have a recognition that he is operating very closely from the scripture and to know those different biblical allusions that he's pointing back to. So what we were thinking about today, or with death and error, one of the prevailing motifs that seem to recur is this liberation from Egypt, or this liberation from Pharaoh that the Israelites, the Hebrew people, experienced in the book of Exodus. They were in slavery, they were captive, they were oppressed, they cry out to God, and God frees them, right? Frees them from Egypt and from Pharaoh's grip. But Ephrem takes that as the starting point to say that there was a real redemption, a real liberation that happens there. But all the more so when Christ comes into the picture, and in our reality now, through Christ, there is redemption, not from Egypt or Pharaoh, but actually from death and error. Right? Through Christ, we're able to experience a real, not just like a symbolic, but a real liberation from those two terrible oppressors.
Yeah. And I like the way that he talks about it. He says that in Egypt was a pair of symbols. And he says the same thing about Pharaoh. You know, Pharaoh is a pair of symbols, and they're both related, but maybe there's some nuance between the two. Like in Egypt, the pair of symbols is Sheol and error, right? So Sheol is this realm of the dead where before Christ, all those who died, I guess their souls would dwell there in this realm of the dead, where it's kind of like they're just asleep in a sense. So, and error, at least from the context I understand, basically to be sin. Is that kind of your assessment of the term?
Yeah, that falsehood.
Yeah.
Kind of, I think in Ephrem's context, are really concerned about what is orthodoxy, right? So what would be falsehood, like heresy, or the false understanding of reality?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Right. So darkness in its kind of broader sense. Yeah. Yeah. So it's cool. The way he plays with the analogy is really rich. I mean, he talks about how, first of all, like the pattern is, he goes, as a result of the Paschal Lamb, so the Old Testament lamb that was sacrificed, as a result of the Paschal Lamb, and he says something, is as a result of the living lamb, yada, yada, yada. So yeah, it's kind of a cool back and forth between the two. So like, for example, as a result of the Paschal Lamb, he talks about how even though Egypt was greedy and the people were greedy and all of that, as a result of the Paschal Lamb, it gave up its gold, because there's that right when Moses is leaving Pharaoh's presence for the last time. Right. Pharaoh says, okay, then get out of my presence. The next time I see you, you're going to be dead. If I see you again, you're going to be dead. And the Lord instructs Moses to have the Israelites ask their neighbors, basically, if they can have some gold and silver. And for some reason, all the people give it to them. Yeah. Right. So, and then they just get all this free gold right before they leave Egypt. And so it's kind of an odd thing. But St. Ephrem says, well, the same, just as though, even though Egypt was so greedy, it just freely gave up all of its gold. In the same way, Sheol, the land of the dead, was greedy for souls. It was hungry and greedy for souls. And yet, through the living lamb, it just vomited all the souls back up. It's pretty cool. It's that same thing. So Sheol and error, they were both hungry, and they would keep eating souls, but now they vomited them up through the living lamb, right?
Yeah. And in some ways, it almost seems like in both the case of Egypt and Pharaoh, and then Sheol, right, and Satan, it seems like it's really like the leader that's the great opposer, or the oppressor, or the one that's in opposition to God. But their dominion is actually not really even their own dominion, right? Their dominion is still subservient to God in some ways.
Wait, say that again. Are you referring to Pharaoh, or?
Yeah, so I'm thinking that even if Pharaoh has all this power, seemingly power over Egypt, in reality, from the biblical narrative, we know that Pharaoh doesn't really have absolute power over Egypt, because if God inspires the people of Egypt to say, you need to give gold, they'll give gold.
Oh, sure.
Right?
Gotcha.
And same thing with Sheol. It's even if Satan has all this control over, I'm going to capture and bring them into this shadowy existence of Sheol, if God says, I want these souls to be vomited out, in some ways it kind of has to happen, right? So their dominion is actually not really their own dominion. God's the one who has real dominion over everything, right?
Yes, it's all a matter of what you're comparing with, right? It's relative in the sense that relative to us, Egypt, Pharaoh, relative to the Israelites, is powerful, and but relative to God, it's weak. And so I think the same applies, when it comes to sin and death, right? For us, relative to us, it's very powerful, and I want to explore that some more in a second. But what you're saying, relative to God, even death is a creature, even sin is in, I don't know if it's a creature, but it's creaturely, right?
Yeah.
And it's subject to God's dominion and power. Yeah, no, that's an important reminder for us. Yeah. So Egypt is a pair of symbols of Sheol and error, and then Pharaoh is a pair of symbols of death and Satan. And they're both related. They're both very, very much related. But I think when St. Ephrem talks about death, he's primarily talking about physical death, the destruction of the body, the separation of the soul from the body's going into the graves and such. And then, of course, Satan is kind of the personification of evil, I guess. He's so it's related to sin, but there's kind of there's Sheol and death, there's error and Satan. But anyway, so the analogy goes that the allegory is that Pharaoh, being this double symbol for death and Satan, he had detained everybody. He had detained the Israelites as slaves, and as slaves, they were practically like dead people, because they were being oppressed so harshly, and they didn't have their freedom and such. So they were like dead people. And yet, through the Paschal Lamb, Pharaoh had to release them, from captivity. And so the same way the living lamb, because in the gospel according to Matthew, it talks about how when Jesus, when he was rising from the dead, that the graves of people were opened, and the saints, actually, I think it says the saints roamed Jerusalem, something like that.
Something like that.
Right? Yeah. But this idea of the graves being broken open, it's analogous to the dead coming out of Egypt, coming forth into freedom, right? So, yeah. So there's these powerful symbols there. Yeah. So let's kind of delve in a little bit more deeply. So that's the surface level, like not surface level, but that's kind of the
big picture, or like the meta.
Big picture.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's delve a little more deeply into what this means, right, for us. What does it mean that death is conquered? Whenever I reflect on the nature of fear, like fear about any particular thing, right? Okay, let's say, you're afraid that you're not going to pass an exam, or you're afraid of some confrontation with someone. If you reflect on it enough, I really believe that ultimately fear of any particular threat is the threat is a manifestation of death, is a particular manifestation of death. It's a kind of death, because, yeah, I mean, so I don't know. Does that ring true with you? I could say more on it, but
yeah. I think from my experience, it definitely rings true, right? We become paralyzed by fear, and we end up not moving or not being able to do anything and not truly being able to live, right? We're afraid to
yeah,
live.
exactly. Yeah, because I mean, what is a threat? A threat is something that can harm you, and the ultimate harm that can be done to you is the annihilation of your being.
Mm-hmm.
So every threat is a manifestation, a particular manifestation of the ultimate threat, which is death. And therefore, every fear, I believe, is a particular manifestation of the ultimate fear, which is the fear of death.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so, because, like, I remember when I used to watch these mafia movies, like the Goodfellas and Godfather and all of that. I remember I used to just sometimes, like, when one of the mafia bosses will be like, take care of Father Joby for me, or something like that. Send him on a vacation. I don't know how they say it, but and they would just go and they would just whack this guy, right?
Okay.
And it would be off somewhere, maybe where nobody would see, nobody would know. And then that guy would just be absolutely gone. And I used to sit there. I don't know. It's just this thing wrestling with the reality of death. Like, he's gone. Like, that guy is just, somebody just decided somewhere for their own selfish reasons that so-and-so shouldn't exist anymore. And then boom, he just ceases to exist. In a way, it's totally unfair, that anybody should have that power to make another person cease to exist. It's just, they're gone. You can't interact with them anymore. You don't see them anymore. You can't, get advice from them. I mean, they're just gone. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And now I'm talking from a human perspective here about, the natural level of the nature of death. But I think if you reflect on death even more, like I'm talking about murder. But if you reflect on death even more, then you realize, well, it's the same thing when people die in war. And okay, like you think about maybe a mother whose son is out there, and like right now with all the wars going on, and then all of a sudden you get the news, it's like he's gone. But then you reflect even further and you realize all death is like that. In a sense, all death is kind of unfair. It's just so, I don't know, it's so hard to swallow the reality of death that a person can just all of a sudden, boom, cease to exist,
Yeah.
Yeah, so death is a terrible, terrible thing. I think it's safe to say.
No,
Yeah.
definitely. And I think in the parish ministry, right? Like I think in our community, one thing that I really appreciate actually about our Syro-Malabar community is just seeing that when someone loses someone that's very precious to them, right? It seems very procedural. Okay, we go to the house and we say an uppies and we do this and all this other kind of stuff, right? But the reality is like there's a deep and a real loss. And I mean, we might try to throw in like the spiritual platitudes or the pious comments, right? To say like, oh well, they're still with us in the Eucharist, and they're gone to a better place, and they're still here, but just like in this different mode of existence. And those are things all true, right? Those are all true. However, I think what you said, Father Thomas, is that the reality still stands that there's a change in that mode, and that mode is there is a loss there, right? There is a loss that they're not as tangible to us now, right? Um,
Yeah, I mean, there's a change in mode is perhaps the good news, right? Like, imagine if,
they
at
just
a
cease to
natural
exist.
level, what I mean? Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
that's what I mean. Like, at a natural level, that's what it is. It's
Yeah.
it's like that person just ceases to exist, and we take it for granted now because even outside of Christianity, kind of in the general secular culture, a lot of people will say things like that. They're in a better place,
Mm.
right? I mean, I think there's a widespread belief in some form of life
Afterlife.
after death,
Hmm.
right? Yeah, afterlife. But we take that for granted because I'm not saying that that idea was introduced by Christianity. It wasn't. But at the same time, like a lot of the ancient world did not believe that there was life after death, right? Um, so, I mean, including a lot of the Israelites didn't
Yeah.
believe in life after death. I mean, we see that even in the Gospels. A very prominent group of the Jews were the Sadducees,
Mm.
and they were mainstream Jews. It wasn't like some so, and they didn't believe in the afterlife, right? The Pharisees did. So imagine that, like no afterlife. So you're just going based on at the human level. Boom, this person is just gone. And you just have to be okay with it. You just have to accept it. And one day you're going to just be gone. Boom. And there's nothing you could do about it. And it's really weird. I mean, it's almost like if you think of all of the endeavors of your life building upon each other, you think of, okay, I want to improve every day, become better at all these different aspects of my life. If the culminating reality is that you're just going to cease to exist anyway, you work backwards from there. It's kind of like, well, if I'm going to cease, let's say I'm going to cease to exist tomorrow.
Mm.
Well, then I guess it doesn't matter what I'm going to do today because I'm going to cease to exist tomorrow. So, well, and then you go one step back from that. And the day before that, you go, well, tomorrow, day after tomorrow, I'm going to cease to exist. It doesn't matter what I do today. You could literally work back, like if you work backwards to where the entire scope of your life is kind of meaningless because it's building up to nothing.
Yeah.
The culminating, moment is when you become nothing.
Yeah. And that's where
Um,
nihilism comes in, right?
yeah, and it's very
Yeah.
real.
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
think we can just downplay that. I mean, I would say, like right now, I think there's a good percentage of depression and all that
Yeah.
stuff, despair, hopelessness. It's all real. I mean, there is actually cause to be depressed,
Hmm.
if not for these truths that we're speaking of right now, that St. Ephrem is singing in praise and thanksgiving, which is that Jesus has actually really, truly conquered death.
Yeah.
And whoa, that's wild. Which means that yes, it is a change of mode. Is that now? In fact, now death, oddly enough, becomes a good thing because it's the only way in which we can enter into eternal life and
Yeah.
eternal glory. It's the passageway, and no, it's not. I take your point for sure, which is that we can't just say these things and expect that that a person is going to all of a sudden be chipper. A
Yeah.
person who's suffered loss and such.
Mhm.
Um, but because a person has to process the grief and all of stuff and come to those truths. But in a real way, I believe that believing Christians do not get stuck on the loss of death because of the hope that we have in the resurrection. Right. Actually, one of your favorite saints, that was I believe that's how she had her conversion, right? Saying Edith Stein.
She did.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, it was her seeing the hopefulness of one of her friends who lost her husband, right? And her thinking like there's really, I think she kind of probably, I mean, she was a professed atheist at the time, or at least agnostic at the very least, right? But and I think to your point, like what exactly does the afterlife look like? Even Sheol, right? Sheol was this very shadowy, kind of a sleepy existence, right? It wasn't like fully alive in the presence of God or anything, but yeah, it was when it's one of her dear friends died, and seeing
that was a funny thing.
Yeah.
No, that was a funny thing, was that it was her friend died and she couldn't get over it.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, she saw that her friend's wife, through her faith, was able to actually
comfort others, even
and comfort her. Yeah. Like the guy's wife, the widow, was comforting her, and she was just like, it just kind of blew her away. But so it's very real.
Yeah.
The hope that we have is very real.
Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted, right? Jesus promised it.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so I think death is truly the last enemy of mankind as a whole, and of every person who has ever lived. The final enemy. You can conquer many obstacles in your life. You can you learn from, you trip, you fall, you learn, you grow stronger, you conquer. But when you reach that final enemy, every person, every human being will find themselves powerless before that final enemy, except for by the power of Christ, who has conquered death. And then all of a sudden, so I think that final reality, which in a sense should always be present to us, we should always be aware of, is one that we have to learn to conquer by letting go of our own efforts and our own self-reliance, and relying on the power of Christ, who obtains that victory for us.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
Reliance, dependence, right? Dependence and the ability to even follow. Because I think even if we were to take this Exodus story and mark it very closely, which Ephrem is doing, right, with the liberation of the people, right, from Egypt, and the liberation of the peoples, everybody, from error and death. What we see from the book of Exodus, right, is that the first part, right, is where they are crying out to God, they are freed. It's very magnificent. But the second part, which is actually the larger part, is them grumbling and struggling and them getting through the desert, and kind of this back and forth of do we follow God? Do we go back to where we were? Kind of a thing. That's actually kind of where our life stands, right? That we do experience this real redemption and this real liberation. But the task at hand is, and probably the task why maybe Ephrem is even linking this so closely to Exodus, is that's our journey. We have been freed from death and error, but we have to continue relying and depending on God, lest we go back to that state and that oppression again.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you're right. That's such a big part of their journey, looking back.
Yeah.
Right. Which is it's a very strange thing, because they're literally liberated from slavery. I mean, literally, and they want to go back, because they're like, well, we didn't have to suffer well, actually they did have to suffer, but they wanted the food that they had back in Egypt.
The garlic, onions, and flesh pots, whatever that means.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, can you imagine you're en route escaping from slavery, and you're like, man, I really miss that garlic. That was good.
Garlic's
You know,
great, I guess, but
and I think it's kind of comical, and if we follow this allegory, not just of Saint Ephrem, but of course of the whole New Testament, um, this that comical looking back shows us something of our comical looking back as well. You know, that we have been liberated from death through Christ, and yet in strange ways we can find ourselves what I would call self-sabotaging, you know, for lack of a better word. So just like Jesus is, okay, I've freed you from death, and yet in weird ways we can find ourselves killing ourselves, attacking ourselves, hurting ourselves, you know, behaviors of self-sabotage, right?
true.
And there are a lot of those behaviors that we can all get into. And Lent is, I think, a hopeful time for us to be able to identify those things and to eliminate them from our lives, right? So that we can, so it's and that's one helpful distinction to make, where Lent is not necessarily a time where we are trying to it's not a time where we are achieving our own salvation, right, through strenuous efforts and such, but it's a time where we have to renounce and let go in a more intense way, a more focused way, of those things which are self-destructive.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
first of all, primarily spiritually, but in all ways. Yeah.
Yeah. Father Thomas, I'm really glad that you said Lent is a hopeful time, because I think oftentimes people, sometimes even what I would have thought in the past, is that Lent is a time of like rigor, and in some ways of like a almost like a holy oppression, right? Like we take on all of these like fasting and prayer and penances and things of that sort, almsgiving, and just really just being very rigorous. And but at the same time, that's not actually what's true, right? In some ways, actually, all of these rigor is meant to free us from the oppression of these other things that have been enslaving us most of the year without us even knowing it, right? So that's what makes Lent so hopeful. It's not that Lent is actually oppressive. Lent is actually liberating. It makes us realize
Exactly.
how dependent and how enslaved and chained we've been to these other things. Call it money, call it pleasure, call it, what have you. And these things are now, okay, the chains are being broken. I can really see reality as it is, and there's a real freedom being with Christ that I have kind of lost sight of, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's like what St. Paul says, you know, to the Galatians, even though that's given in a specific context, its meaning applies more generally. For freedom, Christ has set you free. Stand firm, therefore, and submit not again to a yoke of slavery.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, where have I submitted again? Even though I've been liberated from slavery, where have I submitted myself back again to slavery? And I want to. So I like the way you put it in terms of it's about liberation.
Mm-hmm.
It's an exodus. It's
Yeah.
the new Passover. It's really about liberation from slavery, from, you know. So and that connects to the second part, right? The dual symbols. There's death and Sheol, that aspect of things, and then there's error,
Mm-hmm.
right? And Satan. There's that whole reality. Sin too is another terrible, terrible thing. You know, if you
Yeah.
wanted to capture maybe all terrible reality that we have to encounter as human beings, that's probably a good way to capture it, right? There's death, and then there's sin. There's a line from an old U2 song, right, where Bono, he says, "Where can you go to leave yourself behind you?"
Mm-hmm.
Those words have they're pretty profound, you know, and different people say them in different ways, I'm sure. But if you think about it for a second, like I remember, you know, someone that I was helping, and he was trying to move somewhere new. He was like, "Oh, I got to get out of this place and go somewhere else so that I can straighten things out or whatever." And I don't know, maybe you've met people like that, or you've done something like that. But of course, the reality is you can leave, you can pick up and say goodbye to all these connections and relationships and then say, I'm going to move somewhere else and start afresh. But where can you go to leave yourself behind you? Yeah. And that's part of the horrific nature of sin, is that it's very easy for us to focus on all the evils outside and all the evil influences of that oppress us and all of that. And I think we do that a lot today in this day and age. It's almost like to be Christian means that you're basically pointing out all of the evils that are in the world, right? Mm-hmm. But that's not primarily the meaning of of a Christian, right? Because, I mean, look at who Jesus was speaking to. He wasn't speaking to the Roman emperor, He wasn't speaking to the entire rest of the world that was pagan. Mm-hmm. He was speaking to the Jews. He was speaking to the believers. All of the teachings that he gives are about their own purification and transforming their unbelief into belief and such. Well, anyway, so for us as Christians, this reality of sin, where can you go to leave yourself behind you? How can you escape from the internal evil that we see inside of us? So that too can be a source of despair, just like death can be a source of despair. If you really take time to reflect and look within, and you see the sin and the sinful tendencies that are within, that too could be a source of despair.
Truly.
Right?
Truly. And this is not to induce any scrupulosity, right? Not at all. So this is not to induce scrupulosity, but I think being Christian is really the recognition of how heinous and terrifying really sin is, and to remind the world of that. Because, I mean, think about it. The sin of Adam and Eve, right, was enough to completely put us into this ruptured human condition. If that was just one sin's effect, think about just how destructive, right, sin can really be. If that one sin was able to cause this much damage, right?
Absolutely.
So, but again, I mean, not to cause scrupulosity, but just to recognize the reality of it. And then what we talked about a little bit earlier, right? Relative to us, sin is very destructive, powerful, terrifying. But relative to God, he is far more powerful, right? So how do we ally ourselves, turn ourselves, restore ourselves in that relationship with God, and be able to minimize and hopefully eradicate sin from our lives by recognizing how destructive it is and how creative, beautiful, and worthy, right, is our relationship with God.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up that point about scrupulosity, and in a sense that part of the challenge maybe of talking about sin is there is a widespread scrupulosity that we're seeing in the church and such, and there's other problems like that. But here's kind of the challenge, right? So when you're speaking about how serious sin is, you're merely acknowledging a reality that everyone already knows. And I don't even just mean Christians. You go anywhere in the world, like sin is the one universal thing that everyone can acknowledge, because I mean, maybe I don't know, maybe if you're very young, maybe, but anybody who's an adult, let me say, just looking back at their own lives or looking at certain patterns of their behavior that they deeply regret, they know sin, they see the effects of sin. It's real. It's kind of like I don't know, like nuclear weapons, right? They're just terribly dangerous. They cause immense harm. And by talking about it, you don't necessarily want to make somebody paranoid and anxious. And yet at the same time, it's just a real thing that there are nuclear weapons stacked up, around the world, and that can happen. So the challenge is this, that what do you do with a reality that is so deadly and so harmful, and everybody knows it is, but what do you do with that? Well, one option is, let's try to pretend it doesn't exist, right? Let's try to pretend there are no nukes in the world. Everything's cool. Everything's great, whatever. Let's try to pretend there is no such thing as sin. And that's what we've seen, I think, in the modern world. But the problem is that when you try to pretend that something real doesn't exist, all it does is just haunt you more and more, right? Because you can't just pretend something doesn't exist. You're confronted with the reality every day, or at key junctures in your life and key interactions and relationships in your life, you're confronted with that reality. So it actually becomes more and more terrifying. So that's kind of like the secular approach to dealing with the reality of sin and guilt and shame, is let's pretend that there is no such thing as sin as much as we possibly can. And that doesn't work. But this is the approach that we profess as Christians, and which St. Ephrem professes, and what you just spoke about, which is that Jesus has he's liberated us from sin. Sin no longer has dominion over us. Satan no longer has dominion over us, just like Pharaoh no longer had dominion over the Israelites. They were set free by the immense power of God through manifestations and signs that Pharaoh saw, and he finally just had to let go of them. He had no choice, because God is that much greater than Pharaoh. And so our belief, our firm belief, our hope, and the message that we proclaim is that God is that much greater than your sin. He's so much greater, and his power is so much greater than sin, that you no longer have to be afraid of sin, and you no longer have to be afraid of death. Which is pretty good news.
Very good news. And shameless plug to approach that God in confession, right? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, and that's a whole nother topic, but it's like, if people, all of us, if we could realize that confession is the place where we can encounter that mercy personally, that regardless of the sin, whatever it is, regardless of the extent of our shame, that we're being met with the immense power of God, which is that much greater than our sin, which is so much greater than our sin. And not only is it greater, but just like with death, he conquered death so much so that now death has become the passageway to life. And death has become, in that sense, a good thing, oddly, in the same way our sin too. That he's conquered our sin so much so that when we approach him and we receive his mercy, the very place of sin now becomes the entryway, the passageway into greater glory, right?
Yeah.
So our sin gets transfigured into greater glory, which is amazing.
Truly. And that's a whole other topic of how our wounds actually become a place of great holiness, right?
Yes, indeed. Well, actually, there's this quote from the Catechism. Maybe we can end on this. It's in paragraph 385. It says that the revelation of divine love in Christ manifested at the same time the extent of evil and the superabundance of grace. So basically what it's saying is that because of the way in which divine love was revealed in Christ, we actually are able to acknowledge the gravity of sin, to see its intrinsic malice more so than we could have without Christ. And yet, at the same time, see the superabundance of grace, that grace goes so much farther, than sin. So it's a message of great hope. And all of this whole journey is centered around a meal, right? Yeah. So you had the Paschal Lamb, the meal of the Old Testament, and we have the living Lamb, the Eucharist, the meal of the New Testament. for a people that's liberated from sin and death once and for all in Christ.
For peoples, right? For the peoples.
For peoples, yes, yes. All the peoples gathered around this banquet. Yeah, from the east and the west. Yeah. Very good. Well, thanks, Father Joby. Good conversation with you, as always.
As always. Thanks, Father Thomas.
All right. Look forward to the next one. Peace.
Peace.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the In Spirit podcast. In Spirit is an initiative of Amoris Christi, an apostolate dedicated to lay spiritual formation. For more information and to keep up to date, you can visit our website at amorischristi.org and follow us on social media.